Two doors face each other across a narrow lane, and a war neither can survive. But the sharpest blade isn't the one you wield. It's the one you forget to lower. We begin our story now. The bell over Hermione Granger's door had a particular voice, a thin silver note that always seemed to arrive a half-second after the door itself opened, as though the shop needed a moment to decide whether it approved of who had entered. She had grown fond of that hesitation. It was the only thing in her life lately that took its time. It was the last week of August, and the rain had been falling on Hogsmeade since before dawn. Not the dramatic kind that announced itself, but a fine, patient drizzle that beaded on the leaded glass and slid down in slow threads, blurring the lane outside into smears of grey and lamp gold. She stood behind her counter with a faux glass cradled in both hands. Its surface clouded the way old enchanted things clouded when they had been loved badly and then abandoned. Someone had hexed it decades ago to show only what they feared, and then, she suspected, had spent the rest of their life unable to stop looking. Her thumb moved over the tarnished rim. Restoration was the part of the work she loved most. The slow coaxing, the listening, the way an object would eventually surrender its history to a patient enough hand. She did not look up when the noise began across the lane. At first, it was only hammering. The empty shop front opposite hers had stood vacant for the 8 months she'd been open, its windows soaped over, a sun-bleached to let sign curling in the door. She'd grown so used to its blank face that she'd stopped seeing it at all. Now there were workmen on the cobbles, and the scrape and ring of iron, and the particular crackle that meant magic was being worked into wood and stone, wards being laid, a sign being hung. A competitor. She felt the small drop in her stomach that any tradesperson would feel, and nothing more than that. The lane was narrow, but the village was not small. There was room, she told herself, for someone selling teacups or quills or whatever it was. Then the soaped windows cleared all at once, a single charm, peeling the white away like frost off glass in spring. And she saw the display they'd arranged behind the panes, and the faux glass slipped from her fingers and rang against the counter. Curiosities, enchanted objects, provenance pieces, arranged with the cold, immaculate taste of someone who had grown up among heirlooms and had never once wondered what they cost. A scrying bowl, a pair of dueling gauntlets, a music box she would have known anywhere because she had been outbid on it at a Diagon estate sale 3 weeks before and had assumed it lost to a private collector. And above the window, the men were hauling the sign into place on its iron bracket, turning it, settling it, and the rain made the fresh gilt of the letters run with light. Malfoy and Black. Curiosities of provenance. Her hands found the edge of the counter and gripped it. The wood was old oak, and it did not give, and she was distantly grateful for that, because it meant there was something in the room that refused to move. She did not decide to cross the lane. Her body simply did it. Around the counter, past the faux glass lying face up and showing her, for one instant, her own white face, and then out into the drizzle without a cloak. The cold of it touched the back of her neck. The cobbles were slick. She crossed the narrow distance between the 2 doors in 7 strides, and on the 8th, the door opposite opened before she could reach it, and he was standing in it. 5 years. She had seen him at the trials, grey-faced and silent in a courtroom that smelled of ash and old fear, and she had not seen him since. Time had drawn him out into something sharper. He was taller than the memory of him, or perhaps only stood straighter now. The boyish softness had been worked off the bones of his face, leaving the architecture of it bare. The pale brow, the grey eyes that found her and held, the mouth that had always known how to be cruel without raising its voice. He wore black, well cut, expensive in the understated way that the truly old money wore its expense. On his right hand, a silver ring caught the wet light. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain ticked against the cobbles between them. Somewhere up the lane, a shutter banged. Granger. He said her name the way one might set down a heavy thing one had been carrying a long while, carefully and with a kind of resignation, as though her existence were an inconvenience he'd anticipated but hoped to be spared. I'd heard a rumour you'd gone into trade. I confess I didn't believe it. It seemed beneath even your appetite for self-punishment. You can't be here. The words came out flatter than she'd meant. The rain was running into her collar now, threading cold down her spine, and she did not move to escape it. This street, this trade, you did this on purpose. His brow lifted a fraction. Did what? Bought a property, filed papers with the ministry, paid an obscene amount of gold for a lease, hung a sign. He let each item fall like a coin onto a counter. I'm told that's what one does when one opens a business. You'd know better than I, presumably. You've had 8 months' head start. So he'd checked. He knew exactly how long she'd been here. The knowledge settled in her like a stone going down through dark water. There are 40 streets in this village. She heard her own voice climbing and hated it and could not stop it. There are empty shop fronts on every one of them. You chose this one. You chose the door directly across from mine. I chose the property that suited my purposes. His eyes moved, once, deliberately, over the rain-dark front of her shop behind her. The modest, hand-painted sign, Granger's, the warm, crowded window with its mismatched, lovingly mended things, and came back to her, and something in them was almost gentle, which was worse than contempt. Though I'll grant you the view is a novelty. I don't believe I've ever before had the pleasure of watching a Granger enterprise from quite so close. It's instructive. A workman edged past them in the doorway with an armful of packing straw, murmuring an apology, and for a moment they were forced nearer to one another to let him through. Near enough that she caught the scent of him under the rain, something clean and cold, cedar and a faint metallic edge like the air after a hex. She stepped back the instant the man had passed. So did he. The retreat was mutual and immediate, and neither of them acknowledged it. "The music box," she said. Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. "I beg your pardon?" "The Aldermaston music box, in your window. I bid on that piece 3 weeks ago at the Pemberley estate sale. I was outbid by an anonymous agent." She watched him, and watched him decide whether to lie, and watched him choose, with what looked almost like boredom, not to bother. "It was you. It was my buyer, yes." He did not even have the grace to look away. "You'll find that's how auctions work, Granger. Someone wants the thing more, or has more gold, or both. In this instance," the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth, gone as soon as it appeared. Both. That piece belongs in the hands of someone who'll restore it. The mechanism's cracked. The third comb is split. You can hear it in the upper register if you wind it past the second turn. It needs... She stopped. She was telling him how to care for it. She closed her mouth. And here, for one unguarded instant, his composure thinned. He glanced back over his shoulder at the music box, gleaming in its place of honor. And she saw that he had no idea. That to him it was a beautiful object and a trophy and nothing more. That the split comb and the dying upper register were Greek to him. That he had bought a wounded thing for the simple pleasure of taking it out of her hands. The realization moved through her as something close to grief. "You don't even know what you've bought," she said quietly. For a moment, he said nothing. The rain filled the silence. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its lazy edge and gone very even, very controlled, and that flatness told her more than any sneer could have. "I know precisely what I've bought, Granger. I've bought a position, a foothold, a trade in which my name still means something to people who can afford to forget the rest." His jaw tightened. The muscle there stood out under the pale skin. "I've spent 5 years learning exactly how much a name is worth and exactly how little. I don't expect you to understand the arithmetic. You were never required to do that particular sum. The cruelty of it was precise. It found the place where her own savings sat dwindling in a Gringotts vault, where every month she did the arithmetic herself and came out a little thinner. It found the 8 lonely months of building this from nothing, with no name to trade on but her own, no inheritance, no foothold but the work of her 2 hands. He couldn't have known all that. But he'd struck near enough to it that her breath caught, and she despised the small betraying hitch of it, and she saw, she was almost certain she saw, that he heard it too. "I'm going to bury you," she said. It came out without heat, which was how she knew she meant it. Not a child's threat shouted across a corridor. A statement of fact, made by a woman with everything she owned, staked on a narrow lane in a wet village. He looked at her for a long moment. The drizzle had darkened his fair hair, plastered a strand of it to his temple, and beneath all the careful armor of his face, something looked out at her that she did not have a name for. Something tired and watchful and not entirely unkind. "No," he said softly. "You're not, but I'll enjoy watching you try." And he stepped back inside his shop, and the door closed between them, and through the cleared glass she could see him cross to the window and lift the music box from its stand, turning it over in his pale hands. Curious now, examining it, as though her words had planted something he could not pull back out. And she stood in the rain on the cobbles of the lane she had thought, until an hour ago, was entirely her own, and she did not move until the cold had soaked clean through to her skin. September came in hard and clear, the drizzle of August burned off by a week of high cold light that turned the lane's wet cobbles to a glaze and made every shop window a mirror. Hermione learned to hate the brightness. It meant that when she stood at her counter she could see, reflected in her own glass, the gold letters across the way, reversed and gleaming. Calby and Yoflam, a thing she could not unsee no matter where in the shop she stood. The first shot was his. She came down on the 3rd morning of the month to find a notice pinned beneath her own sign, weighted against the wind with a neat band of conjured cord. A trade card, expensive stock, the print so crisp it had clearly been struck that night. Malfoy and Black extend their compliments to the neighborhood and announce restoration of enchanted objects undertaken by certified artificers at half the prevailing rate for the autumn season. And below, in smaller letters, the courtesy that was not a courtesy at all. Customers presently committed elsewhere are warmly invited to compare half the prevailing rate. She stood with the card in her hand and did the sum she had done 100 times in the dark, and the answer was the same as it always was. She could not match it, not for a week, not for a season. He had certified artificers because he could pay certified artificers. He had margins because he had capital behind him, a vault that did not thin with every month the way hers did. He could sell restoration at a loss for the whole autumn and feel it no more than a man feels a single raindrop. She sold it at a loss, and she did not eat. Her knuckles went white around the card. She made herself loosen them, one finger at a time, before the stock could crumple, because she would not give him even the small satisfaction of a ruined card thrown in his bin, where some smirking apprentice might find it. She did not cross the lane this time. She had learned that much. Instead, she went inside, and she lit the lamps, and she sat down with her ledger and her own hands, and she thought. By noon, her own card was in the window. Granger's. Restoration undertaken by the proprietor, who has read the object's history before she touches it. Some things are not improved by haste, nor by hands that do not know what they are mending. Estimates without charge. It was longer than his. It was also, she knew, the truth, and she let the truth be the weapon, because it was the only one whose price she could afford. Through the bright glass, she watched him come to his own window at midday and read it. He stood a long while. She could not see his face from across the lane, only the dark shape of him, very still. Then he turned and was gone into the shadowed interior, and she felt the strange hollow triumph of having landed a blow she could not see strike. The next move was hers, and it was a supplier. There was an old woman named Edith Pyle, who lived 3 villages over, and had, for 40 years, been the only person in the south of Scotland who could properly re-silver a faux glass without killing the enchantment in it. She was difficult and deaf, and charged what she liked, and Hermione had spent 6 months earning her trust, going out by the slow road on her half-days, drinking the terrible tea, listening to the same 3 stories about Edith's late husband until she could have told them herself. It was a relationship built the only way Hermione knew how to build anything, slowly, with patience, by hand. She went out to Edith's on the 2nd Sunday of September with a faux glass that needed re-silvering and a basket of the bramble jam the old woman liked, and Edith met her at the door with her arms folded and her chin up and would not let her pass the step. "He's been," Edith said. Hermione's stomach dropped. "Who has?" "Pale lad, fine coat, manners like a knife." Edith's mouth worked. "Offered me a retainer. A retainer, he calls it. Money to do nothing. Money for the promise of my work and none of yours. More gold to sit idle than I've made in 3 years of honest mending." Her old eyes were bright and furious and ashamed all at once. "I told him no. I want you to know I told him no, to his face, on this very step, and then he doubled it." The cold came up through Hermione's boots and into her. Edith, I'm an old woman, lass. The chin came up higher, but it trembled now. I've a roof that leaks, and a sister in Aberdeen I can't get to for the cost of the coach. He knew it. I don't know how he knew it, but he knew exactly the shape of what I lacked, and he laid the gold down on it like he was bandaging a wound. She would not meet Hermione's eyes. I took it. God forgive me. I took it. I can't do your work anymore. I'm bound to his by the terms of it. He had a contract drawn, proper, sealed, ministry witnessed. There's no breaking it. Hermione stood on the step with the basket of jam going heavy in her arms. She thought of the half-days, the slow road, the terrible tea. She thought of how she had assumed, the way she always assumed, that a thing built patiently and honestly was a thing that would hold. And she understood, standing there, that he had not bought a supplier. He had bought the knowledge of her, had found out somehow where she sourced, who she trusted, what she could not do without, and had bought it out from under her with the one resource she could never match, which was money offered without the slightest hesitation to a person who needed it. It isn't your fault, she said, because it wasn't, and because Edith's hands were shaking. Don't. It isn't yours. She left the jam anyway. She walked back down to the road, and she did not cry, because crying was a thing you did when you were finished, and she was not finished. But the long way home in the failing light, she felt the temperature of the war change. It had begun as something almost abstract, a position, a foothold, an inconvenient mirror across a lane. Now it had reached into her actual life and taken a thing she loved out of it, and she stopped pretending, somewhere on that road, that she was fighting only for her livelihood. The retaliation she chose was colder than anything she had done before, and she was not proud of it, and she did it anyway. Malfoy and Black sourced their finer stock through a broker in Diagon Alley named Corvin Thwaite, a fastidious, anxious man who dealt in provenance papers and who lived and died by his reputation for clean documentation. Hermione knew this because she had once, years ago, helped the Ministry untangle a fraud Thwaite had nearly been caught in, and she had let him off the hook because he'd been a dupe and not a villain. And Corvin Thwaite was a man who remembered a debt. She wrote to him. She did not threaten. She was careful never to threaten. She simply asked in the friendly, faintly anxious tone of a colleague whether he had fully verified the provenance on a certain lot of Malfoy and Black's recent acquisitions, given the unfortunate questions that had lately been raised in certain ministry circles about goods passing through old pureblood estates in the chaotic years after the war. Questions of clean title, of objects that had perhaps changed hands under duress, of the kind of paperwork that did not survive scrutiny. There were no such questions. She invented the atmosphere of them out of nothing but the war's long shadow and Thwaite's own fear. It worked exactly as she had known it would. Thwaite, terrified, froze every shipment to Malfoy and Black, pending a re-verification that would take weeks. She had cut, with a single, carefully poisoned letter, the artery through which his best stock flowed, and she felt sick. That was the part she had not anticipated, not the cleverness of it, which came to her as easily as breathing, but the sickness after. She had used the war as a knife. She had reached for the one wound she knew every Malfoy carried, the suspicion that clung to the name like smoke, and she had pressed on it, deliberately in cold blood, to win a fight about a shop. She lay awake that night in the rooms above her own, and she thought, I told myself I was the one who fought clean. And the faux glass on her workbench downstairs, the one she'd never managed to mend, showed nothing at all in the dark, which was somehow worse than if it had shown her her own face. He found out within the week. Of course he did. He came across the lane at closing on a Friday, when the light had gone violet over the rooftops and the last customers had drifted home, and he did not knock. The bell gave its thin, delayed silver note, and he was inside before it finished, the door swinging shut behind him, and the violet dusk came in with him and lay along the planes of his face. He was not sneering now. The lazy contempt that he wore like a coat was gone entirely, and what stood in its place was something stripped and furious and very quiet. Thwaite, he said, just the name. He came to the counter and set both pale hands flat on the oak, and the silver ring rang once, softly against the wood. You went to Thwaite. You took a man who had nothing to do with this, a frightened little clerk who's never done a dishonest thing in his life that he wasn't tricked into, and you made him an instrument. You let him think the ministry was circling. You used the war, Granger. You bought Edith Pyle. Her voice did not shake, which she counted in that moment as a victory. You found an old woman with a leaking roof and a sister she can't reach, and you laid gold on exactly the place where she was breaking. Don't you dare come in here and talk to me about clean hands. For a moment, they only looked at each other across the counter in the dying light. They were too close. The counter was narrow, and she could see the pulse going hard at the side of his throat, and the faint shadow of exhaustion beneath his eyes that the daylight hid. And she understood, with a small, unwelcome lurch, that he was as tired as she was, that he, too, did his arithmetic in the dark, that whatever vault stood behind him, he was standing in front of it alone, fighting a war he had started for reasons she did not understand, and that he was not, beneath the armor, enjoying it any more than she was. I bought a supplier, he said, lower now. It's trade. It's ugly, and it's trade, and I'd do it again. But I didn't reach into a man's worst fear and twist. I didn't use the thing that's killed. He stopped. His jaw worked. He looked, for one naked instant, like someone who had nearly said a true thing by accident and had caught it just in time, and the catching cost him something. You went somewhere I didn't go, he finished, very flat. I'd have thought you above it. That's the joke of it. I'd genuinely have thought you above it. And the contempt would have been bearable. The disappointment was not. It landed somewhere beneath her ribs and lodged there, because it was the disappointment of someone who had, against all sense, held some private picture of her as better than himself. And she had just, with her own clever, poisoned hand, taken that picture and broken it. Get out, she said, because she had no answer, because he was right, and being right about this one thing did not make him right about anything else, and she could not bear another second of his face. He straightened. He looked at her a moment longer, and there was no triumph in it, none, only that terrible quiet. And then he turned and crossed to the door, and with his hand on the latch, he stopped, his back to her, the violet light edging his pale hair, and said, without turning around, "Mend your own glass, Granger, the one on your bench. It's been clouded since the day I moved in. I've watched you fail at it through the window for a month." A breath. "Whatever you're afraid of, it's getting worse the longer you leave it." And then the bell sang its small silver note, and the door fell shut, and she was alone in the dusk with a faux glass that showed nothing, and a sickness in her chest that no amount of being right could cure. The storm came on the last Thursday of September, and it came the way the bad ones always came to the Highlands. Without much warning, the high, clear weather of the month curdling in a single afternoon into a low iron sky that pressed down on the rooftops and turned the lane the colour of a bruise. By 4 o'clock, the lamps were lit. By 5, the wind had found the gap between the 2 rows of shops and made a funnel of it, so that the whole narrow street howled. And the rain, when it came, did not fall but flew, sideways, in sheets that rang against the glass like flung gravel. Hermione had stayed late. She stayed late most nights now. There was little waiting for her in the rooms above, but the ledger and the dark. And she was at her workbench in the back with the unmendable faux glass before her when the first wrongness reached her. Not a sound, a pressure. The fine hairs along her forearms lifted, and the lamp flames bent all at once toward the front of the shop as though something had inhaled, and the air took on the flat metallic taste she knew too well, the bite of ozone, the scent that came before magic went badly wrong. It was coming from across the lane. She was at her own door before she had decided to be. Through the streaming glass, the front of Malfoy and Black was lit a sick, pulsing green, the light throbbing behind the windows in a rhythm that had nothing human in it. And even at this distance, she could feel the wrongness of it in her teeth. In the fillings of her teeth, a deep, grinding vibration, like a note struck below hearing. Something in his shop had woken. Something with old, ugly magic in it had slipped its bindings, and the green light pulsed brighter with each throb. And as she watched, one of his windows starred and then burst outward, glass flung glittering into the rain, and through the broken pane, the green poured out into the storm like smoke from a wound. She did not think. There was no version of the calculation in which she stood at her own window and watched a man die across the lane because they were at war about restoration prices. She wrenched her door open, and the storm took it and slammed it back against the wall, and she went out into the flying rain with her wand already in her fist. The lane between them was 8 strides. The wind made it 20. She fought across it with the rain driving needles into her face, and reached his shattered door and put her shoulder to it and fell through into chaos. Inside, the air itself had gone wrong. The green light came from a tall cabinet thrown open at the back of the shop, and within it an object she could not properly see, something that hurt to look at, that the eye slid off of, was pouring out a sleeting curtain of cold malevolent force, and the curtain had caught him. Draco was on one knee perhaps 10 feet from it, his wand up, his whole arm shaking with the strain of a shield charm that bowed inward under the pressure like a sail in a gale. His face in the green light was bloodless. A line of blood ran from his hairline where the flung glass had caught him. The shield held and bowed and held. but she could see it failing, could see the silver of it thinning at the edges, and could see in his face that he knew it too, that he had perhaps 30 seconds of strength left and was spending them anyway because the alternative was to lower the shield and let the thing have him. "What is it?" she shouted over the howl. His head turned, just a fraction, just enough to find her in the doorway, and across his face went a whole sentence in a single instant. Shock and refusal, and then something that might have been despair, because the last person on earth he wanted to be seen like this by had just walked into it. "Get out," he managed, and the effort of speaking cost the shield, which buckled, and the cold curtains surged forward another foot, and the green light pulsed so hard that the whole shop strobed. "What is it, Malfoy? I can't help if I don't—" "Bindlestone reliquary." The words came through his teeth. "Black family. It feeds on—" The shield bowed again. He gasped. "It feeds on intent, on wanting. The more you fight it, the stronger. You can't overpower it. I've been trying. You can't—" And there it was. She knew the principle. Every restorer knew the principle. It was first-year theory for cursed objects. But knowing it in a book and remembering it with the floor strobing green and a man dying 10 feet away were two different things. And the gift she had, the only real gift she had ever trusted in herself, was that her mind went cold and clear and fast, precisely when everything around it caught fire. You could not overpower a thing that fed on wanting. You could only stop wanting in its presence, and you could not stop wanting. Not really. Not while it was killing someone. The wanting was the most human thing there was. Unless you gave it something else to want against. Unless you— "Drop the shield," she shouted. His eyes found her, wild. "Are you—" "Drop it. It feeds on the fight. You're feeding it. Drop the shield and give me 3 seconds." She was already moving, already at the open cabinet's flank, already pulling from her own coat the thing she carried always, the thing every proper restorer carried, a folded cloth of woven null silk that ate enchantment the way a sponge ate water. On 3, you drop, and I throw. If you're still fighting it when the silk lands, it'll have something to push against, and it'll take us both. You have to let go, Draco. Completely. You have to want nothing. Can you do that? Can you, for 3 seconds, want absolutely nothing? And she saw, in the green strobing dark, the terrible joke of what she'd asked him, because his face, when she said it, was the face of a man for whom wanting nothing was not a technique, but a temptation he'd been refusing for 5 years, and she had just made it the only way to live. 1, she counted. His shield was a sheet of bowed silver, screaming. 2. His grey eyes held hers across the ruined shop, and something in them let go. She watched it. Let go. Watched the fight drain out of him, not into surrender, but into a stillness so complete it frightened her more than the green light did. 3. He dropped the shield. The curtain of cold force, suddenly unopposed, met nothing. No wall, no want, only the great soft refusal of 2 people who in that suspended second wanted absolutely nothing at all. And for 1 heartbeat it hung in the air, baffled, starving, with nothing to feed on. And in that heartbeat, Hermione flung the null silk over the open mouth of the cabinet. The silk drank it. The green light did not go out so much as get swallowed, sucked inward all at once, with a sound like a held breath finally released, and the howling pressure collapsed, and the cabinet doors swung slowly shut on a darkness that was only darkness now, and the lamp flames stood up straight again, and there was no sound at all in the shop but the storm outside and two people breathing. He was still on one knee. He did not get up. He had lowered his wand to the floorboards and was simply kneeling there with his head bowed and his shoulders moving, and the blood from his hairline had run down to the corner of his jaw and dripped once onto the boards, a small black star in the lamplight. Hermione's own legs would not quite hold her. She sat down abruptly on the floor of his shop, 3 feet from him, in her soaked coat, with the spent null silk going inert in her lap, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all. The silence was the strange part. She had expected, if she had expected anything, that the moment the danger passed, they would remember themselves, that he would order her out, that she would go, that the war would resume. But it didn't resume. It simply sat with them on the floor, deflated, irrelevant, and into the space where it had been came a quiet so complete and so unhostile that she did not dare break it, because she could not remember the last time silence between two people had felt like rest. He spoke first, and he did not look up when he did. "How did you know that would work?" "I didn't." Her voice came out hoarse. "I knew the theory. I'd never tested it on anything that big." A sound came out of him. Not quite a laugh, too tired to be a laugh, but adjacent to one. "You walked into a black family reliquary in full flood on a theory. You'd have been dead in 30 seconds on a certainty." She pushed the wet hair off her face. Theory was better. He lifted his head then, finally, and looked at her. And the green light was gone, and the lamps were warm and gold. And in that ordinary light, with blood on his face and his shop in ruins around him, he did not look like the man who had bought Edith Pyle out from under her. And he did not look like the boy from the corridors of their childhood. He looked younger than either, and emptied out, and he was looking at her as though she were a problem he had been certain he'd solved years ago and had just discovered he'd got entirely wrong. "You could have let it take me," he said. Not an accusation. Something more like genuine bewilderment, turned over slowly, examined. It would have solved everything. The shop, the price war, the lane, all of it gone in one tidy accident, and not a soul could have blamed you. You were across the street with a locked door and a witness's clear conscience. Why in God's name did you come? She opened her mouth and found she had no clever answer, no strategic one, nothing that fit the war they had been fighting an hour ago. The true answer was so simple it embarrassed her, and the storm outside threw the rain against the windows, and the lamp flames stood steady, and she looked at the blood drying on the jaw of her enemy and gave him the only thing she had. "Because you were in trouble," she said. "There wasn't a version where I didn't come. There's never a version where I don't come. I've tried to be a person who'd stand at the window and watch. I'm not. I can't make myself into one. I've stopped trying." He stared at her, the thing in his face when she said it. She would think about it for weeks, lying awake, trying to name it. It was not gratitude, though there was gratitude in it. It was closer to grief. It was the look of a man who had built an entire understanding of the world on the foundational certainty that no one would come, that coming was not a thing the world did for people like him, that he had forfeited it, and who had just had that certainty, walked through his shattered door and sat down 3 feet from him on the floor, soaked to the skin, having nearly died to disprove it. He reached up, slowly, and touched the blood on his jaw, and looked at the red on his fingertips as though it belonged to someone else. "You're bleeding," she said, unnecessarily, and her own voice did something strange on the words, and she was already moving toward him across the 3 feet of floorboards, with the edge of the inert null silk lifted in her hand to press to the cut, the gesture entirely automatic, the gesture of a person who mends things, who has always mended things, who reaches toward a wound before her mind can tell her hand whose wound it is. And his hand came up at the same moment, not to push her away, only to catch her wrist, lightly, the way one catches something falling, and his fingers were cold, and the silver ring was cold against the inside of her wrist, and they both went absolutely still, with her hand caught in the air between them and the storm raging on the far side of the glass. His fingers were still around her wrist when the bell over his ruined door gave a broken, off-key note. The storm had bent it, and the spell of the moment shattered. She drew her hand back. He let it go. Neither acknowledged that, for the space of 3 breaths, her hand had hung in the air between them, caught, while the rain hammered the glass. Neither acknowledged that he had not pushed it away. He took the null silk from her himself and pressed it to his own jaw, and got up off the floor with the careful movements of a man whose whole body had been wrung out, and the war did not resume so much as quietly decline to begin again. And she went home through the dying storm, and lay awake until the grey came up over the rooftops, turning her own wrist over in the dark, where the cold of the silver ring still seemed to be printed. For 9 days, nothing. It was the strangest peace. Neither of them advertised a truce, because to name a thing was to make it negotiable, and neither could afford to be seen sheathing the knife first. But the cards in the windows stopped. The half-price restoration notice came down from his glass one morning without comment. She found, 2 days after the storm, that the frozen shipments to Malfoy and Black had quietly resumed. She heard it from Thwaite himself in an anxious, grateful letter that the ministry questions had evaporated as suddenly as they'd appeared, and she understood that she had withdrawn her poison without telling herself she was doing it, the way you stop pressing a bruise. She did not know whether he knew it was her doing. She suspected he did. Knowing things was the one resource he had never lacked. They began, in those 9 days, to be aware of each other, the way you are aware of a sound you've stopped consciously hearing. The deep, registered presence of him across the lane, the times his lamps lit and went dark, the shape of him at his window in the early morning with a cup in his hand, looking out at the weather. She caught herself tracking it. She caught herself, more than once, looking up from a customer or a ledger to find that she had been listening beneath the surface of her own thoughts for the sound of his door. On the 10th day, the letters came. Hers arrived with the morning post, heavy cream stock, a wax seal pressed with a device she did not recognize, a stylized vault door, half open, with a coin caught in the gap. She knew before she broke the seal that it was nothing good. Expensive paper carrying bad news had a particular weight to it. Inside, in print so polished it had clearly been struck by the 100. Abercrombie and Vault, purveyors of fine curiosities, with establishments in London, Edinburgh, and 40 market towns across Britain, present their compliments to the proprietor of Granger's. We are pleased to announce our intended expansion into the historic village of Hogsmeade, and write to extend a generous offer for the freehold of your premises. Abercrombie and Vault prides itself on the orderly consolidation of fragmented local trades into a single trusted standard of service. We are confident the enclosed valuation will be found most agreeable, and trust you will recognize the wisdom of accepting before the natural pressures of a competitive market render independent operation untenable. The enclosed valuation was an insult dressed as a sum. It was less than she had paid for the lease. It was, she understood, reading it a second time with a cold spreading through her hands. Not an offer at all, but a notice. The polite first knock of a fist that intended to come through the door regardless. Before the natural pressures of a competitive market render independent operation untenable. They were not asking. They were telling her what they were about to do to her if she did not take their gold and go. And the genius of it, the real cruelty of it, was that the natural pressures they referred to were the very war she and Malfoy had been waging. A war that had thinned them both, that had each of them weakened and bleeding and watching only each other, so that neither had seen the thing coming up the lane behind them with its 40 market towns and its bottomless vault. She was still holding the letter when she looked up, and through her own window across the lane she saw him standing in his, with an identical sheet of heavy cream paper in his hand. He was not reading it. He had read it. He was looking at her. Across the 8 strides of cobble, through 2 panes of leaded glass, in the flat grey light of the October morning, they looked at each other, and each saw the same letter in the other's hand, and something passed between them that had no words in it, and needed none. The precise, instantaneous understanding of 2 people who have spent months learning to read each other as adversaries, and who now, in a single shared glance, recognize that they have been reading the wrong threat the entire time. She did not decide to cross the lane. By now, she had stopped expecting to decide such things where he was concerned. She set the letter on her counter and went out, and he was already opening his door, and they met in the middle of the street, in the open, in the grey, each with the rain of last week's storm still drying in the cracks of the cobbles beneath their feet, and for a moment neither spoke. He held up his letter. "You too." "Less than I paid for the lease." Her voice was steady. An insult, a threat with good manners. "Mine's the same figure for a larger property." A muscle moved in his jaw. "Which tells you they're not valuing the premises at all. They've set a single number low enough to break us, and they're applying it to both. They don't want the buildings. They want the lane." He turned slowly and looked down the length of the narrow street. The 2 rows of small old shops, the apothecary, the bookbinder, the little place that sold nothing but candles and string. And she watched him see it the way she was seeing it, as a single thing, a whole organism that a larger organism intended to swallow. Avachrome doesn't expand into villages. It consolidates them. It comes in, buys the freeholds at the bottom of a wall. It's careful to let the locals fight amongst themselves first, knocks out the dividing walls, and puts up one great glass-fronted emporium where a street used to be. I've seen it done. There was a lane in Bath. He stopped. There isn't a lane in Bath anymore. There's an Avachrome and vault. The cold in her hands had reached her chest. How long? Before the freeholds fall? If we keep bleeding each other the way we have been? He looked back at her, and there was no cruelty in it now. No contempt, only a grim and level honesty that was somehow far more intimate than either. Months, perhaps less. They're counting on it. That's the part you have to understand, Granger. They didn't pick this lane despite the price war between us. They picked it because of it. We've spent 3 months doing their work for them. Every customer you poached from me, every supplier I bought out from under you, every gold piece we each spent making the other weaker, we were softening the ground for them. We've been so busy trying to kill each other that we walked the both of us straight to the edge of a cliff, hand in hand, and we never once looked up. It was true, and the truth of it was unbearable, and she made herself bear it because there was no time not to. She thought of Edith Pyle's leaking roof and her own poisoned letter to Thwaite, and all the clever, vicious, exhausting moves of the past months, and she saw them now from above, from the height of an Avachrome ledger, and from up there they were not a war at all. They were 2 small animals tiring each other out for the convenience of the thing that meant to eat them both. They've made one mistake, she said slowly. He waited. They sent the letters on the same morning, to both of us, identical terms. She turned it over as she spoke, her mind doing the thing it did, going cold and fast and clear. They're so certain of us, they didn't even bother to stagger it. They think we're so locked into hating each other that it doesn't matter if we both know. They think 2 people who've spent 3 months at each other's throats could never... She stopped. The word she had been about to say sat strange and enormous in her mouth. Couldn't, he finished for her very quietly, ever stand together. The grey light lay between them. Up the lane, the candle and string shop's door opened, and an old man came out and put up an umbrella against a rain that had not yet started, and went off down the cobbles, and neither of them watched him go. They were looking at each other, and the thing that had been impossible an hour ago, a week ago, a month ago, every day of their lives until this one, was sitting in the middle of the street with them, asking to be picked up. I won't sell, she said. I want to be clear about that, before anything else. Whatever else is true, I am not selling my shop to a chain for less than I paid for the lease, and I am not letting them turn this street into a glass box. I will burn the place down myself before I... She caught her own voice rising and reined it. I won't sell, will you? No. It came out of him flat and immediate and absolute, and beneath the flatness, she heard something she had not expected to hear, which was that this mattered to him in the same marrow-deep way it mattered to her, that the shop was not a position or a foothold or a trophy to him any longer, if it ever truly had been, that he had sunk something into this lane that he could no more sell than she could. No, I won't sell. I've spent 5 years building a thing I could put my name on without flinching, and it's that ugly little shop, and they can offer me 10 times the figure, and I will tell them precisely where to put it." His grey eyes held hers. "So, we have, between us, exactly 2 roads. Either we keep on as we have been, we finish what we started, one of us drives the other out, and then Abercrom walks in and buys the survivor's corpse for a song, and the lane is gone, and we both lose everything we have. Or—" He did not finish it. He let the oar hang in the grey air between them, and she understood that he could not be the one to say the rest of it, that the pride that had been bred into his bones across centuries would not let his mouth form the shape of "we work together," that he had come as far as a Malfoy could come, and the last step had to be hers. And she understood, too, that he knew she would take it, that he had calculated her exactly the way he calculated everything, and that for once she did not mind being calculated, because his arithmetic and hers had arrived after all these months, and against every instinct either of them owned, at precisely the same impossible sum. "Or," she said, and held out her hand, there in the middle of the open lane, in the grey October light, with both their letters lying on their separate counters, and a chain with 40 market towns coming up the road behind them. "We stop fighting each other, and we fight them. Together. Both shops. One front." Her hand stayed out between them, steady, an offer and a dare in equal measure. "I can't believe I'm saying this to you. Take my hand before I come to my senses, Malfoy." And he looked at her, offered hand for a long moment, the pale, long fingers of his own at his side not yet moving, the silver ring dull in the flat light, and the whole weight of 2 families, and a war, and 3 bitter months, and one storm-lit night on a shop floor balanced on the few inches of grey air between her palm and his. He took her hand. The pale fingers closed around hers, cool and dry, the silver ring pressing its small hard line against her knuckle. And for the length of one breath in the middle of the open lane, they simply held on. Not shaking hands, not yet, just 2 palms refusing to be the first to let go. And then he gripped, once, firmly, the gesture of a contract sealed, and released her, and the thing was done. They had become, in the grey October light with the rain not yet fallen, allies. Neither of them looked entirely as though they believed it. "We'll need to see each other's books," he said, and the briskness of it was a mercy, a way of stepping back from the strange warmth that had passed up her arm at his touch, and was still, traitorously, sitting in her wrist. "All of it. Stock, debts, suppliers, the lot. We can't fight them blind. If we're to present a single front, we have to know exactly how weak each of us actually is, and you'll have to trust me with the figures, and I'll have to trust you with mine, and neither of us is going to enjoy it." "Tonight," she said, "my shop, after close. I'm not setting foot in yours until that cabinet's been properly bound, and I'm not letting you see my ledger anywhere I can't reach my own kettle." The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile, but the place a smile would live if he ever permitted one. "Afraid I'll poison the tea?" "I'm certain you do it with excellent manners." So it began. The strangest courtship she would never, until much later, let herself call by that name. Not flowers, not candlelight arranged for its own sake, but 2 account books opened side by side on her counter at 10 o'clock at night, and a pot of tea going cold between them, and the lamps turned low to save the oil, because they were both, it turned out, exactly as close to the bone as the other had suspected. That was the first thing the books told them, and it told them simultaneously, and it changed something. She watched him read her ledger, watched his eyes go down the thin columns, the careful economies, the months where she had paid her suppliers and not herself, the savings that had bled out drop by drop into this lane. And she watched him understand, fully and without the protection of his earlier contempt, exactly how little stood between her and ruin. And she, reading his, found the mirror of it. The Malfoy fortune was a ruin, or what remained of it was reparations and seized assets, and the long, quiet hemorrhage of a name no one would lend to, and the capital she had imagined standing behind him like a wall turned out to be a single overextended line of credit and his own 2 hands. He had not been fighting her from a position of strength. He had been bluffing the whole time, exactly as she had been. 2 paupers in good coats, each convinced the other held all the cards. He looked up from her book at the same moment she looked up from his, and the recognition that passed between them was almost unbearable in its symmetry. "You half-priced restoration," she said slowly, "for the whole autumn, at a loss. You couldn't afford that." "No." He did not look away. "I couldn't. I was gambling that you'd believe I could and fold before I went under myself. It was the most expensive bluff of my life, and I'd have lost it inside a month." A breath. "You poisoned Thwaite, knowing it would freeze my best stock. You couldn't have known I was already 3 weeks behind on the lease when you did it. Another fortnight of that, and I'd have been finished. You were closer to winning the whole war than you ever realized, Granger. You stopped a fortnight short. Do you know why you stopped?" She did know. They both knew. She had withdrawn the poison from Thwaite the day after the storm, the day after she'd sat on his shop floor in her soaked coat and watched him look at the blood on his own fingers as though it belonged to a stranger. She had let go of the one move that would have killed him within the week, and she had told herself a dozen reasons, and the true one had been sitting on the floor 3 feet away from her with a cut on his jaw the whole time. "Drink your tea," she said. "It's getting cold." He drank his tea. They worked until 2 in the morning that first night, and the work itself became the strangest intimacy because it required them to stop performing. You cannot armour a balance sheet. You cannot sneer at a supplier's invoice. The figures stripped them both down to the people who had made them, and the people who had made them were, it turned out, frighteningly alike. Meticulous, proud, frightened, each pouring everything they had into one small, beautiful, doomed thing, and refusing on principle to admit how frightened they were. By midnight, they had stopped sniping. By 1, they were finishing each other's calculations. By 2, she looked up to find that the lamps had burned down to almost nothing, and that he had taken off his fine coat at some point and rolled back his sleeves, and that the left forearm, the one that bore the faded grey ghost of a mark, he had spent 5 years and a fortune trying and failing to have removed, was bare on her counter beside the ledgers, and that he had not thought to hide it, and that this, the not hiding, was the most defenceless thing she had ever seen him do. She did not look at it. She made herself not look at it, which was its own kind of looking. He saw her not looking. He turned his arm over slowly so the mark was against the wood, and went on with the figures, and neither of them said a word, and something passed between them in the saying of nothing that no conversation could have carried. They settled into a rhythm over the following fortnight. The days were for the shops, kept separate, the old rivalry maintained in the windows for the look of the thing. For they had agreed, coldly and correctly, that Abercrom must not learn of the alliance until it was too late to counter it, that their best weapon was the chain's own certainty that they would never combine. So, by day they performed enmity, and by night they conspired, and the performance grew harder to maintain in exact proportion as the conspiracy grew warmer. She learned things about him in those night hours that the war had never let her see. That he was funny, dry, vicious, unexpectedly funny, in a way that caught her off guard and made her laugh aloud before she could stop herself, and that her laughter, the first time it happened, made him go still and oddly careful, as though he had startled a wild thing into his hand and was afraid to move. That he knew the provenance of every object in his shop, not as a price, but as a story, and that when he forgot to be guarded, he told the stories beautifully, his cool voice warming, his pale hands describing the shape of a thing in the lamplight. That for all his contempt of her restoration work, he had been watching it through the window for months, and that he understood, without ever having been taught, exactly why an object should be mended by a hand that knew its history. That he had bought the music box, the wounded Aldermaston box, not only to take it from her, but because some part of him had wanted to see whether she could save it. He brought it across the lane on the 9th night. He set it on her counter between the ledgers without a word, and opened the lid, and wound it past the second turn, so that the cracked third comb sounded its dying, off-key note in the quiet shop, and looked at her. "Mend it," he said. It was not an order. It was the nearest thing to surrender she had yet heard from him. "I've watched you fail to mend your own glass for 2 months, and I've come to a conclusion about you, Granger, which is that you can mend anything in the world except the thing you're actually afraid of. So, mend something easy. Mend this, and then perhaps you'll have the nerve to mend the other." Her throat did something complicated. She drew the music box toward her, and her hands knew what to do, though her mind was elsewhere. And she lifted the comb plate and saw the split in the third tooth, hairline, ancient, the kind of wound that had been sung through for a century until it became the instrument's own voice. And she did the thing she did, the patient thing, the listening thing, with him standing close at her shoulder in the low lamplight, not saying a word, his breath even, the cedar and cold scent of him at the edge of her awareness. And she coaxed the metal and warmed it, and spoke to it in the wordless grammar of restoration that was the only language she had ever been truly fluent in. And the split closed, slowly, surrendering its history to a patient enough hand. She wound it. The note came clean. The upper register, dead for 100 years, lifted into the shop, a thin silver thread of a melody, some forgotten waltz, turning over and over in the warm dark, and she became aware, as it played, that he had gone very still behind her, and that the stillness had a quality she recognized from the storm, the stillness of a man wanting nothing, because wanting was the dangerous thing. She turned. He was closer than she'd known. He had leaned in to watch her hands, and she had turned into the small space between them. And now the space was not small at all. It was nothing. It was the width of the music box's thin silver waltz. And his eyes came down from somewhere far away and found her face an inch too near his own, and neither of them stepped back. The melody turned over in the lamplight. His gaze moved once, helplessly, to her mouth and back to her eyes, and she watched him fight it, watched the discipline come down, the 5-year discipline of a man who had taught himself to want nothing because wanting had only ever cost him. And she understood that he would not close the inch, that he could not, that the closing of it would have to be a thing the world did to him, because he had long ago lost the ability to reach for it himself. Her own breath had gone shallow. The waltz played on. She lifted her hand, not quite knowing she meant to, and her fingers found the edge of his rolled-back sleeve, the warm skin of his forearm above the mark. And at her touch, a tremor went through him, fine and involuntary, and his eyes closed. And then the bell over her door gave its thin, delayed silver note, and a voice from the doorway said, "Well, this is interesting." And they sprang apart as though the floor between them had gone to current, and standing in the open door of Granger's at 11:30 at night, shaking the rain from an expensive hat, smiling the smooth and terrible smile of a man who has just been handed exactly the lever he came looking for, was a stranger in the dove-grey livery of Abercrombie and Vault. The stranger took his time closing the door. He had the unhurried manner of a man who has never in his professional life been the one with the most to lose, and he set his wet hat on the end of her counter as though it had been put there for the purpose, and let his pale eyes travel once around the shop. The 2 account books open side by side, the cold pot of tea with its 2 cups, the small lamp-lit intimacy of it, before he allowed his gaze to settle with great satisfaction on the 2 of them standing a guilty arm's length apart with the music box's waltz still turning in the silence between. "Granville Abercrombie," he said. "The younger. My father owns the company. I do the village work, the delicate work." He smiled. His teeth were very even. I'd heard the most remarkable thing, that the 2 warring proprietors of this charming little lane had been seen, of late, keeping rather late hours in one another's company. I confess, I came tonight expecting to find it was idle talk. I am delighted to be wrong. There's nothing I enjoy so much as being wrong in a useful direction. Hermione felt Draco go still beside her, not the soft stillness of the music box, but the other kind, the hard kind, the stillness of a man calculating very fast behind a face gone smooth as the river before a fall. She had learned to read that stillness in a fortnight of nights, and she trusted it now, and so she said nothing and let him take the lead, because this was his country, the country of men in good coats who smiled while they cut. "You've nothing to be delighted about," Draco said. His voice had gone to its coldest register, the bored aristocratic drawl that gave away exactly nothing. "Granger and I were comparing the terms of your father's insulting offer, the better to refuse it in identical language. I assure you, the lateness of the hour reflects only how much pleasure we take in cataloguing the ways your valuation insults us both. Misery enjoys company, Mr. Abercrombie. It does not constitute a conspiracy. Granville Abercrombie was not deceived, and did not trouble to pretend he was. He drifted a step deeper into the shop, trailing one gloved finger along the edge of her counter, and stopped at the open ledgers, and tilted his head to read. And Hermione's hand twitched toward them before she caught it, and saw him see the twitch, and understood she had just confirmed everything. "Comparing terms," he repeated softly, "with your books open to one another, your stock lists, your debts." He looked up, and the smile had not moved, but the eyes behind it had gone flat and interested as a card player's. "Do you know, in my experience, two people do not show each other their debts unless they have decided to share them. That is not war. That is a marriage. And a marriage, Mr. Malfoy, is precisely the one thing my father cannot permit on this lane, because two shops fighting each other will fall into our hands like ripe fruit, but two shops standing together—" he spread his gloved hands, regretful. "Two shops standing together might actually survive. Which would be most inconvenient? We've already bought the bookbinder, by the way, and the candle shop. They were grateful. They saw which way the weather was turning." The cold came up through the floor of the shop and into Hermione's feet. The bookbinder, the candle and string shop, half the lane already gone, quietly, while she and Draco had been bent over their ledgers at night, believing they had time. "Then you've wasted a journey," she said, and was proud that her voice held. "Because we have decided to share them. You're right. We're not at war anymore. So there's nothing here for you. We won't sell, either of us, not separately and not together. And the more of this lane you buy, the more conspicuous you make yourself. And Hogsmeade is a village that does not love a glass emporium where its old street used to be. You can have the bookbinder. You'll find the village remembers who sold them out long after they've forgotten what your prices were." Spoken like someone who has never watched a village forget. Abercrombie picked his hat up off her counter. He was still smiling, but the work of the smile had changed. It had stopped being a greeting and become a thing held up in front of something colder. "Villages forget very quickly, Miss Granger. They forget the moment the new shop is warm and the prices are low and the old quarrel is too tiresome to remember. But I see I shan't persuade you tonight, and I dislike wasting charm on the unpersuadable." He settled the hat on his head and tipped it to her, and then to Draco. And at the door he paused, his hand on the latch, and looked back, and delivered the thing he had truly come to deliver, which she understood only later he had been saving the whole time. "It must be a great comfort to you, Miss Granger," he said pleasantly, "to have found such a steadfast partner in adversity. I do hope, for your sake, that he proves worthier of your trust than he has of others. Do give my regards to your buyer, Mr. Malfoy. Thwaite, isn't it? Corvin Thwaite. Such a nervous little man, so very eager these days to be on the winning side." And he tipped his hat a final time and opened the door, and the thin silver bell sang its delayed note. And he was gone into the rain, leaving the two of them standing in the lamplight with the poison he had dropped already spreading out across the floor between them. For a moment, neither spoke. The music box had wound down. The silence it left was not the warm silence of an hour ago. It had curdled. "What did he mean?" Hermione said. "About Thwaite? About your buyer?" "I don't know," But Draco had gone very still again, and this time the stillness frightened her, because it was not the calculating stillness, and not the wanting stillness. It was the stillness of a man who has just had a door opened onto a room he hoped no one would ever see. I don't know what he meant. He's doing exactly what such men do, Granger. He found us standing too close, and he reached for the nearest thing to drive between us. It's the oldest move there is. Don't let him. Thwaite is your broker. She heard her own voice going careful and cold, retreating step by step back into the territory she knew, the territory of suspicion, which had after all been her home with this man far longer than these strange warm nights had been. Thwaite, who I poisoned against you. Thwaite, whose shipments I froze and then unfroze. And Avacrom knows his name, knows it well enough to call him eager to be on the winning side. How does the chain that's trying to buy this lane know the name of your private broker, Draco? Because they've done their research, the same as I would, the same as you would. Or because your broker is talking to them. The words came out of her, and she could not call them back. And the awful thing was how naturally they came, how easily the old groove of distrust received her, how a fortnight of warmth could not compete with 5 years of knowing exactly what a Malfoy was. Or because you are. You're overextended. You told me yourself. 3 weeks behind on your lease. 1 bad fortnight from finished. I saw the figures. Draco. I read your books. You're drowning. What better lifeline than the chain? Sell me out, sell the lane out, get bought out at a premium for delivering them the one thing they couldn't get on their own. A united front that quietly isn't united at all. Stop. His face had gone white, properly white, the blood pulled out of it, and his hand had found the edge of the counter, and the knuckles stood up sharp and bloodless against the dark wood. Stop talking. Listen to yourself. You're taking the word of a man who walked in here 30 seconds ago for the express purpose of making you say exactly this, and you're saying it. You're handing it to him. You're doing his work for him faster than he could have dreamed. Then tell me how he knew the name. I don't know how he knew the name. It tore out of him, the cold control breaking for the first time she had ever seen, and the rawness of it should have told her everything, should have been the proof, because Draco Malfoy did not raise his voice for things he had done. He went quieter for those, smoother, he hid behind manners, and the only time the armor cracked was when something true had been struck. But she was too far down the old groove to read it. I don't know how he knew, and I have spent 5 years being the man everyone in this country assumes is lying, and I had begun. His voice caught. He stopped. He took a breath and brought the armor back down over the break. Finished, and the cold control when it returned was worse than the shout had been, because she had seen for one instant what was underneath it. I had begun to think, he said, very evenly, very quietly, that you, of all the people in the world, had decided to assume otherwise. My mistake. It appears the assumption is too deeply grooved in you to lift, even by a hand that knows its history. You'll forgive me. I should have remembered that some things can't be mended by anyone, however patient. He took his coat from the back of the chair. He rolled his sleeve down over the mark, deliberately, covering it, the gesture undoing in 3 seconds the defenselessness of the past fortnight, sealing himself back inside the armor she had, for a little while, been permitted past. And at the door, he stopped, exactly where Avacrom had stopped, his hand on the latch in the same place the chain's man's hand had rested, and he did not turn around. "I didn't sell you out, Granger," he said to the door. "I haven't sold anything to anyone. But you've already decided otherwise, and there's nothing I can offer to prove a thing I haven't done. That's the trap of it. That's always been the trap of being me. You can't disprove a crime you didn't commit. You can only stand there while someone you'd started to." He stopped. The word did not come. "While someone watches you turn back into the thing they always knew you were. So, I'll save us both the spectacle." His hand tightened on the latch, the silver ring catching the last of the low lamplight, and his voice, when it came again, was so quiet she had to strain to hear it over the rain. "Mend your own glass. I shan't be across the lane to watch you fail at it any more." And the bell sang its thin silver note, and he was gone, and she stood alone in the curdled lamplight with 2 open ledgers and a cold pot of tea and a music box that had run down, and the certainty that had felt, an hour ago, so solid and so safe, began even as she stood there to develop, in its very centre, the first hairline split of a doubt. She did not sleep. She sat at her counter through the small hours with the 2 ledgers still open before her and the lamp burning oil she could not spare. And she did the thing she had always done best, the thing that had won her every argument of her life and lost her. She was beginning to suspect the only one that had ever truly mattered. She examined the evidence. And the evidence would not hold. She had built her accusation on a single fact, that Granville Avacrom knew the name of Corvin Thwaite, and she had let the fact stand alone, in the dark, at midnight, with her heart still unsteady from a near kiss, and 5 years of old reflex roaring up underneath her. But evidence examined in daylight, even the false grey daylight of 4 in the morning, behaved differently than evidence wielded in heat. She made herself follow it. How does Avacrom know Thwaite's name? The obvious answer, the one she had reached for, was that Draco had told them. But there was a second answer, and the moment she let herself look at it directly, it was so much simpler and so much uglier than the first that she went cold all over. Thwaite knew his own name. Thwaite, the nervous broker, the man she herself had terrified into freezing Draco's shipments with a lie about ministry scrutiny. Thwaite, who had spent his whole career one rumour away from ruin, who lived in mortal fear of being on the losing side of anything. Thwaite, whom she had taught with her own poisoned letter that this lane was dangerous, that the people on it played for keeps, that aligning with the wrong shop could destroy him. She had not turned Thwaite against Draco. She had turned Thwaite against certainty itself, had shown him that the ground under Hogsmeade was unstable, and a man like that, shown unstable ground, does not stand firm. He looks for the firmest thing in sight to cling to. And the firmest thing in sight, the thing with 40 market towns and a bottomless vault, the thing that would obviously win, was Avacrom. She had done this. Her own clever, vicious move 3 months ago had not merely frozen Draco's stock for a fortnight. It had frightened his broker so badly that the man had gone looking for a stronger master and found one and sold them both, the only thing he had to sell, which was information. the name of the lane's weakest player, the figures, the fault lines. Granville Abercrombie had walked into her shop tonight, already knowing exactly where to press, because she herself had spent the autumn showing a terrified little clerk that pressing was how this lane survived. The poison she had aimed at Draco in September had curved around through 3 months and come back to wound them both. And tonight, handed the consequence of her own move, she had picked it up and thrown it at the one person on the lane who had done nothing. She put her face in her hands. There was a worse layer beneath the first, and she made herself reach it too, because she was not, whatever else she was, a coward about the truth, even when the truth was about herself. The accusation had come so easily. That was the thing she could not look away from. She had stood an inch from his mouth with 100-year-old waltz turning in the lamplight. She had touched the bare skin above the mark and felt him tremble. She had been closer to another person than she had let herself be in years. And the instant a stranger gave her a thread to pull, she had pulled it, fast, gratefully, almost with relief, as though the suspicion had been a door standing open behind her the whole time, and she had been only waiting for an excuse to back through it into the cold safe room she knew. Because the warm room was terrifying. Because trusting Draco Malfoy meant standing on ground far less stable than any Abercrombie could buy. Because it was easier, it was so much easier, to believe he had betrayed her than to keep standing in that unbearable lamplit inch and let herself want what she had been, God help her, about to want. She had not distrusted him because the evidence was strong. She had distrusted him because the alternative was to love him, and she had reached for the suspicion the way a drowning person reaches for the bank. The grey came up over the rooftops. She had not moved. The faux glass sat on her workbench in the back of the shop where it had sat clouded and unmendable for 2 months. And she got up at last, stiff and hollow, and went and stood over it and looked down into the fogged silver that had refused all autumn to show her anything. You can mend anything in the world except the thing you're actually afraid of. He had said that to her 9 days ago, standing close in the lamplight. So mend something easy, and then perhaps you'll have the nerve to mend the other. She had mended the easy thing. She had mended his music box, and very nearly mended whatever was broken between the two of them. And at the last instant, she had taken her own clever hands and broken it again, deliberately, because mending it would have required her to be brave in the one way she had never learned. She picked up the faux glass. She had tried for 2 months to clear it with technique, with skill, with every restorer's trick she owned, and it had stayed fogged, because she understood this now, standing in the dawn with her own ruin laid out behind her. A faux glass does not cloud from damage. It clouds from refusal. It shows you what you fear, and it goes blank when you will not look. She had spent 2 months pointing every tool she had at the glass, and not once had she simply stood in front of it and let herself be afraid. And so it had shown her nothing, faithfully, all autumn, the way it had been hexed a century ago to do. She stood still. She stopped working. She let her hands go quiet, and she let the thing she was afraid of come up out of wherever she had been holding it down, and she looked into the glass and let it look back. The silver cleared. It did not show her Abercrombie. It did not show her ruin or a glass emporium where her shop had been, or her savings gone, or any of the disasters she had told herself she feared. It showed her, slowly swimming up out of the clouded depths, a shop with the lamps gone dark and the door locked and no one across the lane. An empty lane, an empty window opposite where a window should have been lit, and herself alone in the middle of it, having driven out the one person who had ever crossed it to her in a storm, having won the war so completely that there was no one left to have won it against. The glass showed her the thing she feared most, faithfully at last, now that she had finally consented to be afraid of it, not losing the shop, losing him. Standing victorious and alone in a lane, she had made safe by emptying it of the only danger that had ever been worth the risk. She set the glass down. Her hands were shaking now, properly shaking, and she did not try to still them. It was barely past dawn. Across the lane his windows were dark. He had not lit the lamps, and she did not know whether that meant he was sleeping or sitting in the same hollow dark she had sat in all night, and she found she could not bear another hour of not knowing. She put on her coat. She did not brush her hair or compose her face or prepare a single one of the careful arguments that were her birthright. She had spent the whole night being right about the evidence, and being right was the thing that had brought her here, and she was done with it. She went out into the raw grey morning and crossed the lane, 8 strides, the cobbles slick with the night's rain, and stood at his door and lifted her hand to it, and found she did not need to knock, because the door was already opening, and he was already standing in it, fully dressed, grey-faced, having plainly not slept either, with his coat on as though he had been about to go somewhere or had only just decided not to. They looked at each other in the cold dawn light. The lane was empty around them, the bookbinder dark, the candle shop dark, half the street already sold out from under them, and the two of them faced each other across the threshold exactly as they had faced each other across it the very first wet morning when his sign went up, except that everything was different now. Everything, and neither of them moved. "It was me," she said. It was not the speech she would have written if she had let herself write one. It was worse and truer than any speech. Abercrombie knew Thwaite's name because of me. I frightened Thwaite in September. I taught him this lane wasn't safe. I sent him looking for someone stronger to stand behind, and he found them, and he sold us both. The thread Abercrombie handed me last night, the one I pulled, it led back to my own hand. You didn't betray anyone. I did 3 months ago without knowing it, and then last night you handed me the truth, and I threw my own crime at you instead of catching it. Her voice was not steady now, and she let it not be steady. And I want to tell you, I did it because the evidence was good, but the evidence was nothing, and I knew it was nothing, and I reached for it anyway, and I have spent the whole night making myself understand why. Do you want to know why? He did not speak. He was very still in the doorway, and the grey light lay along the planes of his face, and something in his eyes had begun, against what was surely his every instinct, to come open. "Because I was about to kiss you," she said, "and it frightened me more than losing everything I own. So when that man gave me a reason to back away from you, I took it. I took it gratefully. I would rather have believed you a traitor than admit what I—" She stopped. The words stood enormous in her mouth, the same word that had refused to come to him last night at this same threshold, and she understood now what it had cost him to stand here and not be able to say it. And she decided, standing in the cold dawn of the emptying lane, that she would be the one of them brave enough to do the thing neither had ever managed. And she stepped forward over the threshold into the doorway with him, close, into the unbearable inch, and lifted her face to his, and his breath stopped, and his hand came up between them, not to push her away, never that, but trembling, hovering, as though he could not quite believe he was permitted. And at the last instant the old discipline rose in him, one final time, and he held himself there, an inch away, shaking, waiting, unable after 5 years of wanting nothing to be the one who closed it. So, she closed it. She lifted the last inch herself, because he could not, because 5 years had taught him that reaching for a thing was the surest way to lose it, and she would not make him unlearn that in a doorway at dawn. She would do the reaching for both of them. Her hand found the front of his coat, and her mouth found his, and for one suspended instant he was utterly still beneath it, frozen with a kind of disbelief, a man bracing for the thing to be taken back even as it was given. And then the bracing broke. The discipline that had held him an inch away dissolved all at once, and his hand, the one that had hovered trembling between them, came to rest at the side of her face. Cool fingers, the silver ring cold for a heartbeat against her jaw, and then warming. And he kissed her back, not coolly, not carefully, with none of the armoured restraint he wore like a second skin, but with the whole pent force of a man who had spent 5 years convincing himself he was not permitted to want anything, and had just been told, in the only language that could not lie, that he was. The cold dawn moved around them. The empty lane held its breath. She felt the tremor go through him, the same fine involuntary tremor she'd felt when she touched the bare skin above the mark, and she understood that he was not trembling from cold or from desire alone, but from the sheer unfamiliarity of being reached for, of being crossed, too, of being the things someone came out into the storm to find. When they broke apart, they did not go far. His forehead came down against hers, and they stood in the doorway breathing the same small column of air, and his hand stayed at her face, and hers stayed fisted in his coat, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing that needed saying that the last 2 minutes had not already said. "I didn't sell you out," he said at last, very low, the words moving against her mouth. "I need you to know I didn't, not for my sake. You've worked that out for yourself, you clever, terrible woman. I heard you do it. But because I want it to be the first true thing between us, with nothing else underneath it. I have never lied to you. I've sneered at you and undercut you, and bought an old woman's loyalty out from under your feet, and I'd answer for all of it. But I have never once lied to you, and I'm not going to start now that I've—" He stopped. The words still would not come. Even now, even here, the habit of guarding it was older than she was. But he tried, and she felt him try, and the trying was its own confession. "Now that I've stopped wanting to be anywhere but across this lane from you," he finished, which was not the word, but was somehow more than the word, and she pressed closer into him and forgave the gap. "I know," she said. I know you didn't. I'm sorry it took me a whole night and a faux glass to believe what I already knew at midnight. She pulled back just far enough to look at him properly in the grey light. The grey eyes no longer guarded, the sleepless shadows beneath them, the cut on his jaw from the storm gone now to the faintest pale line. I mended the glass. At dawn. Do you want to know what it showed me? You don't have to. You. The lane empty and you gone from it. That's what I'm afraid of, it turns out. Not Avacrom. Not losing the shop. Losing. And she found she could say it no more easily than he could, that the word was as lodged in her as in him. Two proud people who had spent their whole lives armed and had never once been taught how to lay the weapon down. And she laughed, a small broken sound, at the pair of them standing in a doorway, unable to say a thing they had just spent the last 5 minutes doing. We're hopeless. Look at us. We can do the thing, and we can't say the thing. Then let's not say it. His thumb moved once across her cheekbone. Let's do the thing. There's a great deal of it left to do, and a chain coming up the lane to do it too, and I find I've stopped being interested in any future that ends with this street as a glass box and you somewhere else in it. He straightened, and some of the old briskness came back into him, but warmed now, lit from underneath, their armour worn loose. Now, inside. Before half of Hogsmeade comes down for the morning post and finds the two warring artifact dealers of Wishbone Lane snogging in a doorway like fourth years, which would do neither of our reputations the slightest good, and would reach Avacrom by noon. She let him pull her inside, and the bell over his door gave its broken, storm-bent note, and they did not, for the next several hours, fight the chain at all. They did something far more dangerous to Avacrom's plans, which was that they sat at his counter with a cold pot of last night's failure cleared away and a fresh one between them, and they planned. For her night of being wrong had handed her, along with all its grief, a weapon. She understood now completely how the chain worked, because the chain had worked this time through her. They did not buy lanes by force. They bought them by patience, by frightening the weak players into selling information and then freeholds, by letting a street's own quarrels soften the ground until the whole thing fell into their hands like fruit, too tired to cling to the branch. And the entire strategy depended on one thing, the single load-bearing assumption beneath all 40 market towns, that the people of a lane could not be made to stand together, that they would always, in the end, sell each other out, because that was what frightened people did, and Avacrom's whole business was the manufacture of frightened people. So, we make them brave instead, Hermione said. The plan was assembling itself in her as she spoke, fast and clear and cold the way it came to her in a crisis, the gift she trusted. Avacrom's bought the bookbinder and the candle shop, but bought isn't gone. The freeholds have changed hands, but the people are still here, still trading, still frightened. Frightened people sold to them. Frightened people can be unsold. Not the buildings, those are lost, but the trade, the custom, the loyalty of the village. If every remaining shop on this lane stands together, openly, as one front, if we make it so that buying out one of us means taking on all of us, then the chain's whole method breaks, because their method only works on people picked off one at a time in the dark. They can't outpatient a street that's decided to be loyal. They can buy the freeholds. They cannot buy the village's affection, and a curiosity trade lives or dies on affection. No one walks into a glass emporium for a wounded music box, mended by a hand that knows its history. Draco was watching her with an expression she was still learning to read. It had pride in it, and a kind of helpless admiration, and underneath both a steadiness that had not been there a fortnight ago, the steadiness of a man who has found, after years of standing alone, that he is no longer the only one holding the wall. "You're proposing," he said slowly, "that we don't fight Avacrom at all, that we simply make ourselves unbuyable, make the lane worth more whole than it could ever be worth sold. I'm proposing we merge." She said it plainly, the word that had been coming for them since the grey morning in the middle of the street with the two letters. Grangers and Malfoy and Black. One shop, both names, both trades, your provenance and my restoration, your eye for what a thing is worth, and my hand for what it can be made into again. Two shops on this lane are two things Avacrom can pick off. One shop that's already the heart of the street, that the whole lane has rallied behind, that does work. No glass emporium can touch. That's not a thing they can buy. That's a thing they have to compete with. And they can't. They've never once in their history actually competed. They only consolidate the exhausted. We stop being exhausted. We become the thing they can't outweight. She held his eyes across the counter. "It's the only way that ends with both of us still standing on this lane. It's also..." And here her own voice betrayed her slightly, went soft at the edges, because the strategy and the wanting had become, somewhere in the small hours, impossible to separate. "It's also the only way I can think of to make absolutely certain you don't disappear out of that window across the lane. Merge the shops, and you're not across the lane anymore. You're here, beside me, where the glass can't show me an empty window." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the counter and took her hand. The same hand she had held out to him in the middle of the street, 4 days and a whole lifetime ago, the offer and the dare. And he turned it over and looked at it, the restorer's hand, scarred and careful and strong. And he pressed his mouth to the inside of her wrist, where the silver ring had once printed its cold line, and she felt the gesture go all the way up her arm and lodge in her chest. "Then we merge," he said against her wrist. "Both names. I'll have it lettered today, and I'll put yours first, before you make that face, because it should be first, because you were here first, and you stayed when staying cost you everything, and you crossed a storming lane to a man you had every reason to let die. Granger and Malfoy. Or Granger and Black, if you'd rather not carry the worse of my two names through the door, I'd understand." "Both," she said. "All of it. I'm not in the business of mending things by leaving out the parts that have history. Granger, Malfoy and Black. The whole wounded provenance of the lot of us, sung through until it's the instrument's own voice." She turned her hand in his so their fingers laced. "We'll need to call the others together. Tonight. The bookbinder, the candle shop, whoever's left and still has the nerve. We tell them the truth, that the chain wins by waiting for us to sell each other out. and the only way to lose Avacrom is to refuse. All of us, all at once, in the open, where it's too late for them to pick anyone off in the dark. And they were both leaning toward the plan now, heads close over the counter, the strategy and the warmth braided together so tightly that neither could have said where the one ended and the other began. When the broken bell above the door sang its bent note, and a shadow fell across the threshold, and Granville Avacrom stood once more in the doorway of the shop, with his hat in his gloved hands and his even smile in place, and behind him, on the cold cobbles of the lane, stood the bookbinder and the candlemaker and 3 other shopkeepers of Wishbone Lane, summoned, gathered, their faces grey with the particular shame of people who have been brought somewhere against their better judgment. And Avacrom said, into the sudden ringing silence, "I do hope I'm not interrupting. I've taken the liberty of calling a little meeting of my own." For a moment, no one moved. Avacrom filled the doorway with his even smile, and his hat held just so. And behind him the gathered shopkeepers shifted on the cold cobbles, not meeting anyone's eyes. And Hermione felt Draco's hand tighten once around hers beneath the counter before he let it go, not in retreat, but to free them both, to stand. They stood together. It was the first thing the village saw of them, the 2 warring dealers of Wishbone Lane rising from behind the same counter at the same moment on the same side. She watched Avacrom register it. She watched the even smile hold its shape while something behind it recalculated, because he had come, plainly, to do here what he had done in a dozen villages, to gather the frightened ones, to make the selling out public and therefore irreversible, to stand in the heart of the lane and let the weak announce their surrender so the strong would lose heart and follow. He had timed it for the morning. He had not known he would arrive to find the 2 strongest shops on the street already merged in everything but lettering, already standing shoulder to shoulder, already past the fear he traded in. "You're not interrupting," Hermione said. She came around the counter. She did not raise her voice. She had learned, somewhere in the autumn, that the quiet thing carried further than the loud one. "You've saved us the trouble of sending word. We were about to call this same meeting ourselves, weren't we, Mr. Malfoy?" "We were." Draco came around the other side, and they stood flanking the doorway, and the gathered shopkeepers looked from one of them to the other with the dawning confusion of people who had been promised a funeral and walked into something else entirely. Though, I confess, our version had rather a different agenda than yours. Do come in, all of you. Mr. Avacrom was just about to explain to the lane how his company intends to thank you for your custom by knocking down the walls of your shops and putting up a glass box where your street used to be. Weren't you, Mr. Avacrom? Go on. They've come all this way in the cold. Tell them what they're selling. The smile did not move, but the eyes above it had gone flat. "I think you'll find," Avacrom said smoothly, turning to the shopkeepers, "that these 2 have rather more reason than most to spin a frightening tale. They're the holdouts, the proud ones, the ones who'd rather see the whole lane go under than admit the village has outgrown its little independent trades. The bookbinder sold last week." Hermione spoke directly to the gathered faces now, to the bookbinder himself, old Mr. Fawley with his ink-stained fingers and his eyes on the cobbles. Mr. Fawley sold his freehold, I'd guess for less than he paid for it, dressed up as a kindness. And I'd guess that when he sold it, the gentleman in the grey livery told him the rest of the lane was selling too, that he was only being sensible, only getting out ahead of the inevitable, that everyone else had already seen which way the weather turned. That's the method. He tells each of you, privately, that all the others have already given up. He manufactures the surrender he came to collect. He buys you one at a time, in the dark, each of you believing you're the last holdout doing the only sensible thing, when in truth, not one of you wanted to sell, and every one of you only did it because he made you believe you stood alone. She saw it land. She saw old Fawley's head come up, and the candlemaker's wife beside him go still, and a look passed down the row of them, the particular electric look of people discovering, all at once, that the fear they had each suffered in private had been suffered by all of them in common, that they had been picked off, not because they were weak, but because they had been kept apart. "Is that true?" Fawley said. He was not looking at Hermione. He was looking at Abercrombie. "You told me Pennick had already sold. You told me the candle shop had taken the offer the week before mine." He looked down the row at the candlemaker's wife. "Marjorie, did you sell before me? Did you?" "I sold the day after you," said Marjorie Pennick, in a voice gone thin with the same dawning fury. "And he told me you'd been first. He told me you'd taken the money gladly and called the rest of us fools for holding out." The silence that followed had weight. Abercrombie's smile, at last, came down. Not all the way, but enough, the smooth surface cracking to show the flat machinery beneath. And Hermione understood that they had reached the precise place where his whole method failed, the single load-bearing assumption knocked out from under 40 market towns. He had built his business on the certainty that frightened people kept their fear private and could therefore be told any lie about each other. The instant they spoke to one another, the instant the fear became a shared thing in a lit room instead of a private thing in the dark, the lie could not survive contact with the people it had been told about. "What's done is done," Abercrombie said, recovering, reaching for the cold authority that had carried him through every lane before this one. "Sentiment is charming, but the freeholds are sold. Yours, Mr. Fawley, and yours, Mrs. Pennick, and 3 others on this street besides. They are my company's property now, sentiment or no, and there is not a thing the lot of you standing about being moved can do to change a signed and witnessed." "You bought the buildings," said Draco. He said it quietly, and he stepped forward as he said it, and Hermione watched him do the thing she had only ever seen him do in the storm. Watched the cold, clear competence come down over him, except that this time it was not turned toward survival, but toward defense, toward the lane, toward her. And it was a different thing entirely to see it pointed outward instead of in. "You bought the buildings, Abercrombie. You did not buy the trade. You did not buy Mr. Fawley's 40 years of knowing which glue holds a Tudor spine and which one cracks it. You did not buy Mrs. Pennick's hands that have dipped every candle this village has burned to its dead and its newborn for 30 years. You did not buy Granger's restoration which is the finest in the south of Scotland, and which no certified artificer of yours could approximate if you gave him a century. You bought 5 empty rooms. And here is the thing your company has never once had to learn, because you've only ever bought the exhausted and the divided. A curiosity trade is not the room. It is the hand and the history and the trust, and those are not freeholds, and those you cannot purchase, and those have just this morning decided to stay exactly where they are. He turned to the shopkeepers. You sold him the buildings. You did not sell him yourselves. Trade out of a barrow on the green if you have to. The village will follow the hand, not the address. Stand together, and his 5 empty rooms are worth precisely nothing, because no one in Hogsmeade will set foot in a glass box to buy a thing the people they love are selling 40 yards away. It was Hermione who finished it, because the strategy was hers, and the closing of it belonged to her. We're merging our shops, she said, to the lane, to all of them. Granger's and Malfoy and Black into one. The heart of the street, restoration and provenance under a single roof. And we are not selling. Not for any figure, not ever. We'll anchor the lane. And we're asking the rest of you to anchor it with us. Openly, all of us named together, so that the whole village knows Wishbone Lane stands as one thing and cannot be bought a shop at a time in the dark. He's already spent his best weapon. He has no second one. His only tool was your silence, and you've just broken it in this room, in front of each other, and it does not come back. She looked at Abercrombie, and she did not smile, because the thing did not call for a smile. You should go now, Mr. Abercrombie. You've got 5 empty rooms to explain to your father, and a long, cold road to the next village, where you'll have to hope very much that no one's heard how this one went. He went. There was nothing else for him to do. A method exposed is a method ended. And he was too much a creature of his trade to waste charm on a room that had stopped being afraid. He set his hat on his head, and the even smile came back up over the machinery like a shutter coming down, and he made them all a small ironic bow, and the broken bell sang its bent note as he stepped out into the cold, and the gathered shopkeepers parted to let him pass, and then closed again behind him. And that was the last Wishbone Lane ever saw of Abercrombie and Vault. It took the whole winter to make it real. These things are not one in a doorway. They are one in the long grey months of work that follow, in the lettering and the legal papers and the knocking through of the wall between 2 shops that had faced each other across a lane for a year. But they did the work, side by side, as they had done the ledgers, and somewhere in that winter the work stopped being a campaign against a chain and became simply a life. The sign went up in the first week of spring, on a morning when the drizzle had come back, the same fine, patient drizzle that had been falling the day his gold letters first ran with light across the lane. But there was only one shop now, spanning both old fronts, the wall between them gone, restoration on her side and provenance on his, and the music box, mended, singing its 100-year-old waltz true, in the window between, where the whole village could hear it when the door stood open. And above it all, lettered in gilt that ran with the soft spring rain, the name they had argued over for an hour and settled in the only way 2 such people could ever have settled it. which was by refusing to leave out a single part of the wounded history of any of it. Granger, Malfoy, and Black. Curiosities restored. He found her in the new knocked-through middle of it on the morning the sign went up, standing where the dividing wall had been, in the place that had been 8 strides of cobble and 2 panes of glass, and a whole year of war. And he came and stood behind her and put his arms around her and his chin on her shoulder. And they looked out together through the rain-beaded window at the lane that had nearly swallowed them both and had become, instead, the thing they shared. "Say it now," she said. "There's no chain coming up the road, no man in the doorway, no evidence to throw. Just us, and a wall that isn't there anymore, and a shop with both our names on it. You can say it now. I'll go first if you like. I've stopped being afraid of the unstable ground. It turns out I was only ever afraid of standing on it alone." She felt him breathe against her shoulder. She felt the old discipline rise in him one last time, the 5-year habit of guarding the one thing that mattered most, and she felt him set it down, deliberately, finally, the way you set down a weapon you have at last decided you will never need again. "I love you," Draco said, into her hair, into the rainlight, into the small lit space that had been a battlefield and was now only theirs. "There, I've said it. I crossed no lane to you. You did all the crossing, every time, in the storm and in the doorway, and just now. But I'll spend the rest of it making up the distance, if you'll let me. I love you, Hermione Granger. I have loved you since you walked into a black reliquary in full flood on a theory, to save a man you had every reason to let burn, and I have been entirely useless against it ever since, and I find I no longer wish to be useful against it at all." She turned in his arms, there in the heart of the shop that was theirs, with the music box turning its mended waltz behind them, and the spring rain running down the glass, and the village beginning to stir along the lane outside. And she kissed him, slowly this time, with no danger to flee, and no stranger to interrupt, and nothing left to be afraid of. And the bell over the door of Granger, Malfoy, and Black sang its thin silver note as their first customer of the morning stepped in out of the rain and stopped and smiled and decided to wait.
So that's the end of the story. Thank you for staying with me. I want to tell you what I was thinking while I wrote this. I kept thinking about one small moment, the moment when Hermione runs across the lane in the storm. She could have stayed at her window. She could have watched her enemy burn. It would have solved all her problems. But she goes anyway. And later he asks her why. She says, "There's never a version where I don't come." That line is the whole story for me, because he is the thing I believe. We spend so much time protecting ourselves. We build walls, we keep score, we decide who is our enemy, and we stop looking too closely, because looking closely is dangerous. If you look closely, you might see that the other person is tired too, scared too, doing the arithmetic in the dark, just like you. Draco and Hermione were not afraid of losing their shots. They were afraid of each other. They were afraid of how it would feel to stop fighting and let someone in. And that is the moral, I think. The bravest thing is not winning. The bravest thing is laying the weapon down, crossing the lane, closing the last inch yourself when the other person can't. So if there is a door you keep facing across some narrow lane in your own life, maybe it's worth knocking. You never know who is standing on the other side, tired of the war, waiting for someone brave enough to come. First, thank you for listening. Take care of each other.